The Macabre history of the Ashford family, a sinister tale deep within the forgotten wilderness of Maine, where fog coils endlessly between blackened trees, and the earth seems to remember every footstep. 3 women maintained what appeared to be a sanctuary of faith for decades. They called it a refuge for broken souls, a place of prayer, repentance, and divine restoration. Women arrived by the hundreds, drawn by whispers of miracles and absolution. They crossed forests and frozen rivers in search of healing. Many entered those stone walls. Far fewer ever walked back out, and those who did return were not the same. Their eyes carried something hollow, something that refused to be spoken aloud. Hidden within the state archives lies a single testimony, sealed away for generations. Officials who read it claimed it carried a weight too obscene for public knowledge, a truth capable of rotting the soul of anyone unprepared. Tonight, that silence is broken. Tonight, the shadows part, and the truth behind the Convent of Eternal Tears finally breathes again within Gospel of the Haunted. This story is not for the casual listener. It does not rely on demons, curses, or divine wrath. Its horror is far more intimate, far more real. What unfolded behind those walls was born from cold intention, from intellect unchained by mercy, from curiosity sharpened into a blade. Knowledge was pursued there with ruthless devotion, and human lives were merely the currency required to pay its price. In the final years of the 18th century, when Maine was still tethered to Massachusetts and civilization thinned into wilderness, the coastal settlement of Millbridge survived by the sea. Fishermen and lumber traders clung to existence against storms and scarcity. Beyond the town, past winding trails, once walked only by native hunters, lay a stretch of forest that locals avoided without knowing why. The land felt wrong, too quiet, as if the ground itself was listening. On a bleak October morning, 3 figures arrived by wagon, cloaked in black and accompanied by crates that rattled with unsettling weight. Townspeople paused their labor to watch. Mother Superior Agatha Ashford descended first, her posture regal, her presence commanding immediate silence. Silver traced her dark hair, and her pale eyes moved with sharp intelligence, measuring everything, everyone. She spoke with cultivated elegance, her words smooth and assured, the voice of someone accustomed to obedience without question. Sister Prudence followed, tall and unnervingly thin, her movements precise and economical. Her hands were remarkable, steady beyond nature, fingers long and bloodless, as if they had never known tremor or doubt. She observed rather than engaged, her pale gaze revealing nothing, her silence pressing heavier than speech. When she did speak, her tone was clipped, distant, edged with something that unsettled even hardened men. The youngest, Temperance Ashford, emerged last. Her beauty struck like a sudden chill. Dark hair framed a face too still, too composed. Her eyes lingered on people in a way that made skin prickle, not with admiration, but with assessment. Mothers drew their children closer without understanding why. Her smile existed, but it did not belong to warmth. It belonged to study. The sisters claimed their practices were nothing more than rigorous spiritual guidance, insisting these were the proper accommodations for what they called intensive healing. Yet even as their assurances echoed in polite conversation, An unease settled like a shadow over those who dared enter their world. Among the first to lend credibility to their methods was Dr. Samuel Hartwell, a physician who traveled the harsh frontier between settlements, carrying both hope and medicine in his worn leather satchel. A man in his 50s, known for progressive thinking in the treatment of mental disorders. Hartwell found himself captivated by the sisters' seemingly extraordinary understanding of feminine psychology. During their initial meeting, he was stunned by their knowledge. Where most physicians of the time could barely name the symptoms of melancholy or hysteria, the Ashford women spoke fluently of causes, treatments, and intricate behaviors. He marveled at their methods, writing in his journal of techniques, so far ahead of our American practice, it might as well be another world. But what Hartwell did not record, what never touched the pages of his official notes, were the private arrangements he made with Mother Superior Agatha. In whispered conversations behind closed doors, it became clear that his support came at a cost. In exchange for referring difficult cases to the convent and providing medical instruments through his connections, Hartwell would receive detailed case studies that might elevate his career, as well as generous monthly payments. A frontier doctor, scraping by, found the offer irresistible. Oblivious to the darkness it would tether him to, word of the convent spread like smoke through the settlements. Families whispered of miraculous transformations, of unruly daughters and unmanageable wives returned home serene, composed, obedient. The price was steep, yet paled before the relief it promised. $20 silver for a month, 50 for 3, 100 for what the sisters termed complete reformation. To desperate families, scandalous behavior demanded such extreme measures, and the convent's reputation grew unchecked. The women sent to the convent reflected the anxieties of early 19th century America. Those who refused to submit to arranged marriages, young mothers who concealed the names of their lovers, wives who questioned their husband's authority, daughters who dared to read, think, or speak. These were the candidates. The sisters' influence transcended denominational divides, accepting Puritan, Anglican, Methodist, and Baptist alike, claiming that Christian discipline could reform all. The threads of rebellion and defiance wove a tapestry of victims, each one entering the convent under the guise of salvation, never realizing the cost of their compliance. The first inkling that something was profoundly wrong came on a night wrapped in cold February darkness, the year 1803. Thomas Brewster, a young trapper of 20, hunted through the snow-covered forest near the convent, following the trail of a wounded deer. He knew the woods intimately, the crack of ice, laden branches, the distant howl of wolves, the whisper of wind through frost-bitten pines. Yet that night, the forest sang a different song, a grotesque, human melody that made his blood turn to ice. Screams tore through the night, rising and falling in waves of despair and agony, interspersed with whimpers that crawled along his spine. Abandoning his prey, Thomas crept toward the source. The convent loomed above the snow, its dark stone walls cold and impenetrable. The windows revealed nothing, yet from the basement, faint flickers of light shimmered beneath drifting snow. The screaming intensified, punctuated by the metallic clink of instruments, urgent murmurs, and something unmistakably alive, the moans of terror. Pressing closer, he glimpsed a scene that would haunt him forever. Through the frost-streaked glass, he saw the basement transformed into a surgical theater. Oil lamps and candles cast trembling shadows on the stone, illuminating a tableau of unspeakable horror. A woman lay restrained upon a wooden table, leather straps biting into her wrists and ankles, her head locked within a cruel metal frame. Sister Prudence hovered over her, pale fingers manipulating a long, slender rod with precision that was almost hypnotic. The woman's scalp had been partially shaved, dark lines drawn in ink-forming maps of pain, exposing an opening in her skull that revealed bone, and beneath it, the horrifying reality of raw brain tissue. Her eyes, wide and frantic, pleaded for mercy that would never come. But her tormentors were clinical in their detachment. Mother Superior Agatha, serene and unreadable, took meticulous notes, recording each reaction with the precision of a scientist documenting a lab experiment. Novice Temperance moved quietly, handing tools to Prudence as if participating in routine care, the faintest smile on her lips betraying a fascination that made Thomas's stomach twist. He watched, paralyzed, as the rod sank deeper into the woman's skull, each movement calculated, deliberate, unflinching. The air carried the metallic tang of blood, the oppressive weight of fear, and a silence heavier than the snow outside. It was a silence that absorbed sound, that seemed to stretch time itself into an endless corridor of dread. Thomas could feel it pressing against his chest, pressing against his mind, whispering truths he was not meant to know. The convent's horror was not supernatural. It was human, designed and executed with the cold logic of intellect gone mad. And yet, even as terror threatened to consume him, Thomas did not move. He could not turn away. He became witness to the unthinkable, a participant by mere observation, trapped in the quiet testimony of horror. Every detail, the flickering light, the restrained screams, the measured calm of the Ashford sisters, etched itself into memory. He would never forget the sound of the metal rod puncturing flesh, the cold detachment that masked sadistic intent, or the way the room seemed to exist outside the natural world, a domain governed by fear and precision alone. Because the Convent of Eternal Tears did not merely house darkness, it perfected it. And somewhere beneath the snow-draped forest, beneath the thick stone walls, and the carefully maintained facade of piety, the echoes of agony and the deliberate cruelty linger still, waiting for the day they can reach the surface once more. They claimed persecution, presenting themselves as devout Anglican sisters seeking sanctuary in the New World. Their letters bore seals and signatures impressive enough to silence doubt. Their gold flowed freely, easing every concern. Land was purchased deep inland at a price so generous it erased suspicion. Construction began immediately, and the forest was carved open to make way for stone. The screams had reached a châtilleranger crescendo, echoing through the stone walls, as if the building itself shuddered in terror, only to abruptly vanish when the woman's consciousness slipped away. In the suffocating silence that followed, the sisters moved with mechanical precision, as though her unresponsiveness mattered nothing. Their focus never wavered, their hands never trembled. The coldness in their movements burned itself into Thomas Brewster's memory, searing an image he would never escape. Overwhelmed, paralyzed by revulsion, he fled into the snow-choked night, tripping over drifts and roots, heart hammering with panic. Every step carried him further from the horror, yet closer to a realization more dreadful than anything he had witnessed. This was not the first time. These walls had swallowed agony before. They had been built to contain it. By morning, Thomas arrived breathless at his father's blacksmith shop, eyes wide, lips quivering as he stumbled over words of torture, metal instruments, and unspeakable pain. The elder Brewster, a man of practicality and steady judgment, froze. He had long been a pillar of the town, valuing order and community above all else. But the intensity of his son's account made him uneasy. Thomas spoke of instruments too precise to be fantasy, of a room whose layout he could describe in meticulous detail, of faces marked by clinical detachment while inflicting pain. Perhaps the mind plays tricks in the dark, the father said cautiously. A blizzard, a wounded animal, isolation, our senses deceive us. Maybe what you saw was some extreme medical treatment. The sisters have reputations for treating delicate conditions intimately. But Thomas's recounting was undeniable, almost rehearsed in its terrifying clarity. He remembered the gleam of metal against flickering candlelight, the restrained movements, the surgical tools arranged with obsessive order, the unflinching gazes of the Ashford women as they performed their procedures. This was not the random violence of insanity. It was deliberate, methodical, horribly practiced. Concerned yet cautious, the elder Brewster consulted Deacon Morrison, a man whose voice and judgment had guided Millbridge for decades. The Ashford sisters had been exemplary citizens, generous in charity, composed in appearance, respectable in every visible regard. Many prominent families currently had daughters or wives under the sisters' care. We must tread carefully, the deacon warned, his calm voice belying the storm of unease beneath. Accusations like these can shatter reputations, rip the town apart. These women are seen as pious, not criminals. There must be reason, some explanation for what your son believes he saw. But prudence did not prevent curiosity. Morrison agreed to investigate discreetly, visiting the convent under the guise of discussing a church fundraising event. Mother Superior Agatha greeted him in the austere parlor, a room dominated by a heavy crucifix and paintings that seemed to judge intruders with silent scrutiny. She moved with grace, offering tea, inquiring about his family with warmth that seemed genuine, entirely unaffected by the gravity of what he suspected. When Morrison delicately mentioned the reports of strange nocturnal noises, her expression shifted only slightly, an almost imperceptible tightening around her eyes. With calm authority, she explained that the sounds were part of intensive night prayers for the most troubled residents. Her voice, cultured and serene, described spiritual battles against pride, lust, rebellion, and sin, forces she claimed could take physical expression in cries and convulsions. Some souls, she said, her tone suffused with a kind of solemn sadness, require extraordinary measures to extract evil that has taken deep root. What you heard were not screams of suffering, but of demons being cast out. Her words carried the kind of theological sophistication that made even cautious men nod, a logical veneer masking the monstrous reality beneath. Agatha offered a tour of the upper levels, leading Morrison through dormitories, stark yet immaculately maintained. Women sat quietly in prayer, their movements deliberate and mechanical. Their eyes, when glanced upon, seemed vacant, distant, observing some unseen horizon. There was no warmth, no spontaneity, only the unsettling precision of beings trained into stillness. When Morrison asked about the basement, the Mother Superior smiled with modest propriety, a mask of innocence. The lower chambers, she explained, were reserved for women requiring the most concentrated spiritual guidance. The treatments were so intimate, she claimed, that male presence would compromise dignity and sanctity. The soul, she said, cannot be purified under the gaze of the uninitiated. Her words, layered with devout authority, hid a truth darker than any forest night. The basement was not a place of prayer, but a meticulously designed chamber of human experimentation and calculated suffering. Morrison left convinced, yet unsettled. He carried the vision of disciplined women, silent and obedient, and a gnawing sense that appearances could mask horror beyond imagination. And somewhere in the frozen wilderness, beneath snow, stone, and the carefully maintained facade of piety, the cries Thomas heard that night had not ended. They lingered, trapped in walls, echoing through corridors, a deliberate cruelty waiting patiently for ears attuned to listen. The Convent of Eternal Tears thrived on this tension, a perfect symbiosis of terror and trust. Outsiders saw charity, discipline, and spiritual refinement. Those who entered the basement chambers felt something entirely different: precision, calculation, and the chilling certainty that every scream, every instrument, every shadow had been repeated countless times, honed into an art of controlled agony. And so the convent endured, a monument not to faith, but to human obsession, a place where curiosity had no morality and knowledge had no conscience, where innocence could enter as a plea for healing and emerge fractured, haunted, irrevocably changed. Because the Ashford women did not merely punish, they studied, they catalogued, they perfected terror into ritual, and somewhere, beneath those snow-laden pines, the echoes of their work wait, patient and eternal, for the next witness foolish or brave enough to step too close. What rose from the soil disturbed the men who built it. The convent was massive, fortress-like, its walls thick enough to swallow sound. Windows were narrow slits placed high above reach. The lower level required deep excavation, reinforced far beyond reason. Doors were fitted with iron, and locks of unusual strength. Channels were carved beneath the floors, and ventilation shafts threaded the walls like veins. It did not feel like a place of worship. It felt like a containment. When questions arose, Agatha answered with serene authority. Solitude, she said, was the purest path to salvation. Separation from the world was mercy, not cruelty. Most accepted this explanation. A few did not. But gold has a way of quieting fear, and winter has a way of erasing footprints. Once the convent opened, women began to arrive. They came broken by grief, shame, illness, and desperation. They were welcomed with gentle words and locked doors. Letters home became infrequent, then stopped entirely. Those who left did so thin, silent, their movements cautious, as though still watched. They never spoke of what happened inside. Some could not sleep, others could not bear touch. All carried the same distant stare, as if part of them had never escaped. Inside the stone walls, prayer masked procedure. Hymns muffled screams. Scripture framed experimentation. Prudence's hands worked with horrifying precision, guided by Agatha's theories and Temperance's cold fascination. Pain was catalogued. Fear was measured. The limits of endurance were explored with surgical devotion. Faith was not their god. UNDR was. The convent stood for decades, untouched by law or suspicion, its secrets absorbed by stone. When it finally fell silent, when no more wagons arrived and no bells rang, the forest reclaimed it slowly, as if reluctant to remember. Investigators found records burned, chambers sealed, instruments rusted into shapes no one wished to name. And yet one testimony survived. One voice refused to vanish. It spoke of rooms without light, of whispered instructions, of suffering mistaken for salvation. Authorities locked it away, fearing what would happen if such truth escaped into the world. Because once you know what humans are willing to do in the name of enlightenment, you can never return to innocence. The Convent of Eternal Tears does not haunt because it was evil. It haunts because it was intentional. And somewhere beneath that forest floor, the stone still remembers every sound it swallowed. The explanation given to Deacon Morrison had seemed entirely reasonable within the boundaries of frontier propriety, and yet, as he rode back through the frostbitten woods, a nagging sense of unease coiled around his mind like smoke. Something about the convent was profoundly wrong. The women he had observed moved with a rigidity that was too exact, too synchronized to be natural, as if their bodies obeyed commands their minds no longer issued. Their silence was unnatural, oppressive, a quiet that pressed us against the ears and filled the senses with a tension that would not relent. And there was a smell lingering in the halls, subtle yet unmistakable, a stench beneath the cleanliness of polished wood and simmering teas, something metallic and thick, like the battlefield hospitals Morrison had visited during the Revolutionary War, where the stench of blood and suffering lingered in every corner and clung to your throat like smoke. After his visit, the Ashford sisters intensified their control over the convent. Windows were shuttered, doors reinforced, and the once piercing screams of tortured women were replaced by an almost unbearable silence, as though the building itself held its breath. Locals continued sending daughters, wives, and troublesome girls into the sisters' care, drawn by whispers of miraculous transformations. But observant townsfolk began noticing patterns that defied explanation. Women who entered returned not reformed, but altered, hollowed in ways that made even their families question the nature of their own memories. Mary Prescott, a fiery girl of 19 with laughter that could light a room and a tongue sharp enough to scandalize a parish, was one such victim. Her parents, exhausted by her repeated refusals of suitable suitors and public defiance, entrusted her to the convent for 6 months. When she returned, the change was immediate, terrifying in its perfection. Gone was the lively spark, replaced by docility, so complete it seemed unnatural. Mary moved through her home as a ghost of her former self, eyes blank, voice soft and unremarkable, never speaking unless prompted, never showing preference or desire. The first marriage proposal that arrived was accepted with a mechanical compliance that made her parents uneasy, but the true horror revealed itself in quiet moments. She could not recall favorite foods, cherished objects, or the friends of her youth. Letters she had penned before her departure became indecipherable, foreign documents devoid of meaning. And most alarming of all, no emotion registered within her. Joy, sorrow, pride, and pain had all been erased. Dr. Samuel Hartwell, ever the loyal supporter, praised the sister's work as extraordinary. "The patient has been cured," he claimed. The defects that made her unsuitable for marriage and motherhood have been completely removed through rigorous spiritual discipline. But Mary's mother noticed other signs, small yet unmistakable, thin, precise scars across her daughter's scalp, hidden beneath strands of hair, revealed only when combed or washed. When asked about them, Mary could offer nothing beyond the faintest recollection of praying to become a better woman. The cases multiplied. Hannah Morse, sent to the convent after the death of her infant, emerged months later cheerful, unaffected, denying the very existence of the child she had mourned. When confronted with the tiny garments and toys that had once filled her life, she looked on with a calm detachment, eyes vacant, as if encountering relics of another person's existence. Elizabeth Thornton, a merchant's wife sent for hysteria after publicly accusing her husband of infidelity, returned after 4 months insisting no such scandal had ever occurred. She described her marriage as perfect, her husband flawless, her previous accusations non-existent. But her body betrayed a different story: severe, recurring headaches that left her bedridden, confusion that crept into memory, frequent disorientation even in familiar surroundings, and the same delicate, deliberate scars etched upon her scalp. Hartwell's initial admiration for the Ashford methods transformed over the years into something darker. His writings grew erratic, infused with feverish obsessions about the advancement of science and the necessary sacrifices demanded by knowledge. He began drinking heavily, mumbling late into the night about human potential and the price of progress, his once revered intellect fracturing under the weight of secrets he could neither confess nor escape. Outside the convent, life continued, unaware of the subtle horrors being catalogued within the stone walls. Families who believed they were securing guidance and correction were instead delivering daughters into an intricate web of psychological and physical transformation. Each patient, each experiment was refined, catalogued, and perfected. The Ashford sisters moved through this world of suffering with chilling efficiency, their hands steady, their intentions unyielding, and beneath the snow-draped forests of Maine, beneath the frozen earth and the thick stone walls, the echoes of their work endured. They lingered in the air, trapped in corridors that had known every scream, every whispered plea, every subtle whimper of defiance crushed. Under the weight of discipline, they waited, patient and eternal, for the next unsuspecting witness, brave or foolish enough to venture too close, for the cycle to continue. The Convent of Eternal Tears did not merely transform, it consumed. It reshaped the mind, the body, the very essence of its residents until nothing of their former selves remained. Obedience was absolute. Thought was secondary. Memory was a malleable tool, reshaped, erased, rewritten. And somewhere, within that cold fortress, behind doors that never opened, behind windows that never reflected the outside world, the sisters continued, perfecting terror into ritual, honing human suffering into something systematic, clinical, and irrevocably permanent. The horror of the Ashford sisters was not in the brutality alone, nor in the screams that had faded into silence. It lay in the deliberate, patient, methodical perfection of their art, the careful crafting of human lives into shadows of obedience. And those shadows, unseen by the world, remain, waiting, watching, patient, eternal. After his death, Dr. Hartwell's private journals were discovered, revealing a man caught between professional admiration and the gnawing weight of conscience. His writings betrayed a torment that clawed at his reason, an unrelenting struggle to reconcile the horrors he had witnessed with the scientific brilliance he could not deny. The procedures I have observed defy every principle of medical ethics I was ever taught, he confessed in one trembling entry. And yet, the results cannot be ignored. The sisters have accomplished what European physicians only theorize: the manipulation of personality, the selective suppression of memory, the alteration of behavior through direct intervention in the brain itself. Every step is recorded, every effect measured. Their methods are precise, consistent, reproducible. And I must ask myself, are we advancing human knowledge or committing unspeakable atrocities under the guise of enlightenment? During this period, the flow of correspondence between the convent and European medical institutions intensified to an almost frantic pace. Couriers and postal workers, bribed with generous sums, could not help but note the constant stream of letters, packages, and crates marked with foreign addresses. Manuscripts of arcane medical theory, surgical instruments polished to cold perfection, chemical compounds in glass bottles, and preserved biological specimens arrived regularly, while detailed reports, clinical, meticulous, and chilling, were dispatched abroad. Mother Superior Agatha herself began undertaking monthly journeys to Portland and Boston, always returning with additional crates of equipment requiring delicate handling. When questioned by curious townsfolk, she explained that the convent was pioneering revolutionary treatments, combining spiritual guidance with the latest advances from European medicine. Her cultured demeanor, flawless education, and apparent piety made these claims believable, even admirable, in a community that prized faith and intellect in equal measure. Yet beneath the surface, suspicion quietly festered. Martha Goodwin, whose daughter Rebecca had been sent for what was termed intensive spiritual instruction, began noticing patterns that suggested something far darker. Women who emerged from the convent bore only fragmented memories, faint recollections of prayer, whispered instructions, and the monotone rhythms of religious discipline. The lives they had lived prior, friends, families, passions, desires, seemed to vanish like smoke. Martha's inquiries revealed an even more chilling fact. Some women never returned at all. When families pressed the sisters for answers, the official explanation was elegant and unwavering. The women had achieved such profound spiritual awakening that they had voluntarily chosen permanent residence, dedicating their lives entirely to prayer and devotion. Requests to visit these transformed residents were always politely refused, cloaked in the sanctity of silence, the necessity of seclusion, and the inviolable dignity of spiritual pursuit. As word of these miraculous transformations spread, the convent's reach expanded. Wealthy families from New York, Philadelphia, and even Charleston sent daughters to the remote Maine institution, paying exorbitant sums for promises of total reformation. Fees increased accordingly, sometimes as high as $500 for 6 months of intensive treatment, with guarantees of permanent eradication of undesirable traits. By the second decade of their operation, the Ashford sisters had established themselves as authorities not only in New England, but internationally, their correspondences and case studies drawing attention from the most prominent physicians across Europe and America. Dr. Jonathan Whitmore of Harvard Medical School, for example, maintained a correspondence with the sisters for over 15 years. In letters preserved in Harvard archives, he marveled at the sophistication of their observations, the correlation of surgical intervention with predictable personality changes, the detailed records of behavioral modification, the precision and consistency of their methodology. What he did not know, and could not know, was that these letters were descriptions of systematic trepanation, targeted lobotomy, and careful brain trauma, primitive by modern standards, yet horrifyingly advanced for the era. The Ashford sisters had mastered cranial anatomy through years of unregulated experimentation, applying knowledge that legitimate researchers could only dream of, derived from animal studies or post-mortem analysis. Their research was relentless and terrifyingly methodical. Detailed records documented each patient's pre-treatment personality, habits, and mental traits. Every surgical procedure, every calculated incision, every response elicited during operations was logged with meticulous care. Observations after treatment, alterations in memory, personality, cognitive function, and behavior were noted with the precision of a scientist recording laboratory data. Sister Prudence emerged as the most skilled practitioner, refining what she termed targeted cranial intervention. Her anatomical sketches, discovered decades later, revealed painstaking measurements, precise angles, and calculated points of entry that indicated a mastery of brain structure inconceivable for the time. During procedures, patients were sedated with opiates like laudanum, but never enough to fully escape awareness. The sisters required responsiveness, the faintest flickers of consciousness, so that every mental and behavioral shift could be observed in real time. Questions were asked, commands issued, reactions recorded, and through it all, Prudence's hands moved with clinical detachment, a terrifying bullet of precision, patience, and control. What Hartwell observed, and later recorded with increasing despair, was not merely surgery. It was the deliberate reshaping of human life itself, the crafting of obedience, the meticulous erasure of memory, personality, and resistance. The Ashford sisters did not merely treat, they engineered, and beneath the snow-draped pines, within those thick stone walls, their experiments persisted. Patient, eternal, and hidden, They awaited the next family, the next desperate parent, the next soul foolish or brave enough to cross the threshold. Because the horror of the Ashford sisters was not in brutality alone. It lay in the perfection of their craft, the patient, methodical, deliberate transformation of human beings into shadows of compliance. And those shadows, though unseen, remain, waiting, watching. Eternal, Novus Temperance. Once the youngest and most observant of the sisters, had transformed into the architect of psychological domination, the mastermind behind what they called behavioral reconstruction. She devised meticulous routines to reinforce the effects of their surgical interventions, blending reward and punishment, sensory manipulation, and relentless psychological pressure into a seamless web of control. Diet, sleep, temperature, isolation, all were wielded with exacting precision, calibrated to dismantle the existing structures of personality and rebuild them according to the sisters' exacting specifications. No whim was allowed, no resistance tolerated. Beyond these physical and mental manipulations, the sisters expanded into chemical experimentation. Their network of European contacts provided substances far beyond the reach of contemporary medicine, potent compounds whose effects on consciousness, memory, and emotional responsiveness were catalogued with the same scientific rigor applied to their surgical work. Each combination, each trial, each subtle adjustment was logged with obsessive detail. The convent had become a laboratory of the mind, a crucible in which human subjects were melted down and reforged, their original selves carefully stripped away. By 1815, more than 400 women had passed through their programs. Success, as the sisters defined it, was total compliance, the complete erasure of traits deemed undesirable: stubbornness, independence, intellectual curiosity, or emotional complexity. Those who perished during treatment were meticulously noted as failures, their bodies preserved for ongoing study, dissected and measured to advance the sisters' understanding of cranial function and personality. The convent's operations widened further still, incorporating what they called research volunteers, destitute women with no family ties, often widows, vagrants, or prostitutes, lured by the promise of food, shelter, and minor compensation. These women became instruments in the sisters' most experimental procedures, their suffering catalogued, quantified, and analyzed for future refinement. Hidden archives discovered decades later reveal a methodical approach to experimentation that chills the soul. Skull measurements were recorded with surgical precision, brain tissue reactions to stimuli documented with painstaking accuracy, and every alteration of behavior or cognition tracked and correlated with its corresponding intervention. Through letters to European and American researchers, the sisters effectively created a black market in human experimentation, selling insights that could never be obtained through ethical means. Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann of Vienna, for instance, requested guidance on techniques to erase memory, dull emotion, and instill perfect compliance in female subjects. Even institutions like the University of Edinburgh, ironically, integrated the sisters' research into medical curricula without recognizing the dark source of the knowledge. The sisters' work extended into commissioned modifications. Families could request precise alterations, the suppression of artistic inclinations, the dampening of intellectual curiosity, the eradication of romantic attachment, or the installation of unwavering domestic obedience. Each demand was met with a meticulously designed procedure, priced accordingly, and executed with cold, clinical precision. They had honed the art of control to perfection, shaping human lives as one might mold clay, leaving no trace of the person they had once been. Yet the carefully constructed veil of piety and reputation began to fray in the winter of 1818 with the arrival of Sarah Whitman. Unlike the pliant or broken women who had come before, Sarah was defiant and astute, a woman whose mind had been sharpened by education and curiosity. Her transgression was the birth of a child out of wedlock, and her steadfast refusal to reveal the father's identity, a scandal that even her wealthy Boston family could not reconcile. Initially, her parents sought discreet solutions to preserve honor: a marriage, an adoption, but Sarah refused all attempts to curtail her independence, asserting her right to her own life and her child. Deeming her obstinate, her family declared her mentally unstable and sent her to the Convent of Eternal Tears, expecting compliance, reform, and erasure of will. At 24, Sarah arrived with an intellect rare for women of her time, nurtured by parents who encouraged learning, particularly in scientific and medical knowledge. From the very first moments, she sensed the rot beneath the convent's polished exterior. The residents moved with an unnatural uniformity, their gestures mechanical, their expressions vacant. Scars peeked through carefully grown hair, evidence of past interventions. Some struggled with speech, others with memory. Many were entirely unrecognizable as the women they had been before their commitment. Sarah's medical knowledge provided clarity where others had only unease. She recognized the symptoms, understood the procedures, and saw with horrifying lucidity the depth of the sisters' experiments. Every behavior, every response, every apparent act of piety or compliance was a carefully constructed performance, the product of years of relentless, unrelenting modification. The convent was no sanctuary. It was a laboratory, a machine for breaking and rebuilding the human mind with precision and cruelty. And in that moment, Sarah realized she was both prisoner and observer in a house where the lines between healing and torture had been obliterated, because the horror of the Ashford sisters was not measured in screams alone, nor in the hidden instruments, nor even in the erased memories. It lay in the perfection of their craft, the patient, deliberate, methodical transformation of living women into obedient, compliant shadows of themselves. And those shadows, though unseen, remain, waiting, watching, silent, eternal. The results of deliberate surgical intervention in the human brain were no longer theoretical. They were horrifyingly real. From the very first week at the convent, Sarah was subjected to the meticulous scrutiny reserved for all intensive patients. Every curve of her skull measured with precision. Every question about her temperament and habits catalogued. Every neurological response tested under the guise of spiritual assessment. Yet Sarah was not like the others. The Ashford sisters expected submission, compliance born from despair and family shame, but her defiance radiated through every interrogation, every imposed ritual, every attempt to break her spirit. They tried to crush her. Days of solitary confinement in stark, freezing cells, food and water rationed to mere essentials, and hours of verbal degradation designed to erase her sense of self-worth. Sister Temperance, the master of behavioral reconstruction, deployed her full arsenal. Sensory deprivation, alternating extremes of heat and cold, relentless disruption of sleep, ceaseless verbal assaults questioning her intelligence, morality, and very existence. And yet Sarah endured. Not silently, not passively. She observed, she memorized, she plotted. In the isolation, she began to map the convent, memorize the sisters' routines, and track the locations of forbidden rooms that pulsed with hidden horrors. In secret, she documented what she saw. Tiny scraps of paper, stained with ink made from crushed berries, hidden in the seams of her clothing, became a clandestine journal. Every observation, every detail, every subtle irregularity of the sisters' methods was carefully recorded. She noted patterns in the guards' movements, the timing of food deliveries, the schedule of nighttime rituals, and the concealed architecture that facilitated the sisters' control. Her opportunity came with a violent March thunderstorm in 1819. Flooding in the basement threw the convent into disarray, forcing the sisters to relocate patients and equipment. In the confusion, doors were left unattended, locks were misaligned, and the once omnipresent surveillance slackened. Sarah slipped into the shadows, venturing into chambers normally forbidden, each step confirming her worst fears. The basement was a chamber of incomprehensible horror. Operating tables with heavy leather restraints dominated the rooms. Instruments she had never imagined lay neatly arranged on trays, and jars filled with preserved human brain tissue glistened in the dim candlelight. Each jar bore a name, a date, notes on surgical procedure. Her stomach churned as she pored over the meticulous records, diagrams of open skulls, measurements, annotations linking the removal of precise brain regions to observable shifts in personality, memory, and obedience. The sisters' work was no accident. It was methodical, practiced, deliberate. A laboratory of human compliance masquerading as a sanctuary of faith. Even more damning, Sarah uncovered stacks of correspondence, letters from European physicians purchasing the sisters' findings, casually discussing the acquisition of experimental results, human tissue, and behavioral data as if they were commodities in a market. The convent was a business, and its currency was human suffering, traded for profit and prestige. With knowledge in her hands and terror burning in her chest, Sarah began preparing her escape. She understood that intensive treatment loomed, a procedure that would likely reduce her to another blank-eyed vessel. Her window to flee was shrinking with every passing day, and the sisters' suspicion of her resistance was growing. The night came in early April, moonless and dense with fog. Sarah seized a moment of inattention, overpowering a guard with sheer strength and desperation, and fled into the wilderness that hugged the convent's stone walls. For 3 relentless days, she navigated snow, melt streams, jagged terrain, and dense underbrush. Surviving on spring water and edible plants, she recognized from childhood excursions to her grandfather's logging camp. The Ashford sisters had anticipated such a flight and orchestrated an intensive pursuit. Local men, hired under the guise of recovering a wandering or unstable woman, scoured every ridge, every hollow, every thicket. Sarah's flight became a dance of instinct and intellect. Calls echoed through the trees, footsteps pressed into soft earth, yet she moved like a shadow, blending with the forest, slipping into fallen trunks, crouching beneath rock overhangs, and evading capture by mere inches. One harrowing night, a sudden downpour forced her into a hollowed log. She lay within, cold and soaked, listening to searchers comb the ground above, aware that discovery would mean immediate return, or worse. By the third day, her body was betraying her. Muscles ached, dehydration clawed at her throat, exposure gnawed at her skin. Every breath burned with the cold of early April. Every step demanded every ounce of strength. Yet within her chest burned the fire of knowledge, the certainty that what she carried in her mind, and hidden in her tattered journal, could dismantle decades of orchestrated terror. She clung to this purpose, letting it guide her through the forest's labyrinth, past hazards that would have claimed a less vigilant prey. The Convent of Eternal Tears, hidden beneath its veneer of sanctity, had produced its perfect instruments of obedience, each carefully engineered, each soul dissected and reassembled. And yet, for the first time, the sisters faced a mind unwilling to bend, a spirit resilient to their meticulous cruelty. Sarah's survival was not merely a testament to her intellect and endurance. It was the spark that threatened to ignite the darkness they had cultivated for decades, because the terror of the Ashford sisters was not in their tools, nor their screams, nor even the preserved fragments of minds they had shattered. It lay in the perfection of their craft, the patient, deliberate, clinical transformation of living women into obedient, vacant shadows, and those shadows, though hidden from view, remained, waiting, watching, silent, eternal. Bloodied and bruised, Sarah's bare feet tore against the jagged forest floor, each step a fresh torment. The cold gnawed at her limbs, her body trembling as hypothermia crept through her veins, yet she pressed onward. The terror she carried, the knowledge of the Ashford sisters' crimes, propelled her forward with a desperation that overrode every protest of flesh and bone. Survival was no longer about herself. It was about the evidence she held, the secrets she had glimpsed in the flooded basement, the meticulous horrors hidden behind the convent's stone walls. Her breakthrough came in the dim pre-dawn hours, when the muffled sound of a trapper checking his lines drew her staggering form toward a faint light. Joshua Meadows, wary at first of the wild figure emerging from the shadows, softened when Sarah began recounting details no outsider could know. She spoke of hidden chambers, specific instruments, the layout of basement operating rooms, knowledge born of direct observation. Her voice trembled, but the precision of her memory left no room for doubt. Joshua quickly grasped the reality. This was no delirious wanderer. This was a woman fleeing deliberate evil. Clothing, food, and warm shelter were offered, but most crucially, Joshua provided safe passage to the authorities in Millbridge. The journey, however, was suffused with terror. Every rustle in the trees, every distant snap of a branch, reminded Sarah that the Ashford sisters' reach extended far beyond the convent. They had resources, allies, and a network that could track her movements if she faltered. She pressed onward, driven by the urgency of exposing decades of systematic human manipulation. When she finally arrived at Sheriff William Hawthorne's office on April 18, 1819, her appearance ragged, bloodied, eyes wide with panic, met the same initial skepticism that had greeted Thomas Brewster 16 years prior. Hawthorne, a man of practical reason, assumed he faced another victim of wilderness exposure, a mind frayed by isolation and fear. Yet even as he listened, subtle details unsettled him. Sarah's knowledge of the convent's interior was precise beyond what could be explained by rumor. The basement chambers, the locations of concealed storage, the arrangement of operating tables and instruments. This was insider intelligence, but her words were more than testimony. She carried physical evidence, carefully hidden throughout her flight. Surgical logs, correspondence with European medical institutions, and patient records, the unassailable proof of crimes that would shock even the most seasoned authorities. The first document catalogued procedures on 23 women over 8 months. Each entry detailed preoperative personality assessments, surgical notes of deliberate cranial intervention, and post-operative observations tracking behavior, memory, and cognitive function. One entry chilled Hawthorne to his core. Margaret Fowler, a 19-year-old sent to the convent for her excessive reading and intellectual curiosity, considered inappropriate for her gender. The surgical procedure, clinically recorded, described the destruction of brain regions responsible for learning and abstract thought, leaving only the most basic domestic capabilities intact. Post-treatment observations confirmed success. Margaret no longer sought knowledge or intellectual engagement. Her vocabulary was diminished, reasoning impaired, curiosity erased. The sisters' satisfaction radiated from the sterile clinical notes. Even more damning was correspondence from Dr. Hinrich Zimmermann of the University of Vienna, negotiating the purchase of cranial intervention data for thousands of Austrian florins. His letters revealed an international network, universities across Europe, Edinburgh, Berlin, Paris, all acquiring systematic human experimentation data that would be condemned under any legal or ethical standard. The Ashford sisters were effectively suppliers of forbidden knowledge, transforming cruelty into currency. The most harrowing evidence came in the form of a patient catalogue, listing over 600 women processed since the convent's inception. Each name marked with surgical procedures performed, type of treatment, and ultimate disposition. Most were labeled, reformed, sent back to families with personalities meticulously altered. Some were permanent residents, ostensibly by choice, though no verification existed of their continued consent or well-being. Nearly 200 were marked, expired, a clinical term masking death, the ultimate cost of experimentation. Faced with such overwhelming documentation, Sheriff Hawthorne understood the enormity of the crimes he confronted. These were not mere acts of cruelty hidden behind religious piety. They were organized, systematic, and deliberate atrocities conducted with surgical precision and psychological insight. The convent was a factory of obedience, a laboratory of broken minds, and the sisters its architects. Hawthorne immediately organized a raid. 15 armed men prepared to confront the sisters, aware that the operation would demand more than brute force. It would require careful planning, caution, and the vigilance of men prepared for resistance, both physical and strategic. Urgent dispatches were sent to Portland and Boston, summoning federal marshals capable of overseeing crimes of this unprecedented scale. The forest surrounding the convent seemed to tense in anticipation, as if even the stones and trees understood the reckoning that was coming. Sarah, weakened yet unwavering, watched with a mixture of fear and resolve. Every scar, every memory, every stolen document was a weapon against the invisible empire of the Ashford sisters. Her escape had brought her to the edge of salvation, but the true battle, the exposure of decades of orchestrated horror, was only beginning. Because the terror of the Ashford sisters was never merely in the instruments they wielded, nor in the screams that had once echoed through stone corridors. It lay in the meticulous, clinical perfection of their craft, the deliberate reconstruction of human minds into compliant, vacant shadows, and those shadows, though hidden from the world, remained, waiting, watching, silent, eternal. By the morning of May 20th, 1819, the raiding party arrived at the convent, hearts pounding with anticipation, only to find the building eerily silent, abandoned as if the earth itself had swallowed its occupants. The Ashford sisters had vanished under the cover of darkness, slipping away with portable equipment, journals, and delicate instruments, leaving behind only the horrors too vast to transport. Even in their absence, the air of the place pressed down on the searchers with an oppressive weight, hinting at the decades of cruelty concealed within stone walls that had once seemed benign and holy. The basement revealed its true nature in full. A surgical theater, perfectly arranged, instruments gleaming even in the dim candlelight, designed for the most intricate of cranial interventions. Shelves lined with hundreds of preserved brains glimmered in alcohol, each tagged meticulously with patient names, dates, and the precise manipulations carried out. A false wall concealed a chamber of 47 bodies, each displaying evidence of systematic cranial surgery, maintained in chemical solutions that preserved the contours of horror for study. Every corpse bore detailed annotations, a chilling testament to lives reduced to research data, catalogued with the detachment of scientists and the cold cruelty of executioners. File cabinets left in haste offered further proof of unimaginable scale, thousands of pages, chronicling surgical procedures, personality assessments, patient reactions, and correspondence with medical institutions around the world. 2 decades of experimentation laid bare in ink, detailing practices that would not be recognized or ethically sanctioned by legitimate medical science for decades to come. The convent had been a crucible of cruelty, a laboratory where human consciousness was dissected, manipulated, and often destroyed. Dr. Samuel Hartwell, confronted with his complicity, initially tried to rationalize his participation. These women, he claimed, were already lost, unsuitable for normal life, their suffering at least advanced human knowledge. But as the investigators unveiled the breadth of the sisters' crimes, Hartwell crumbled. The weight of systematic murder, disguised as medical treatment, shattered him. Under guard, in the Millbridge jail, he confessed fully. The women known as Mother Superior Agatha, Sister Prudence, and Novus Temperance Ashford were in fact Dr. Agatha Brennan, Dr. Prudence Ashford, and Dr. Temperance Ashford, trained physicians expelled from European medical institutions for unauthorized human experimentation. Dr. Brennan had been banned from practicing in Scotland after patients died under her experimental procedures, meant to correct feminine hysteria through surgical intervention. Dr. Prudence Ashford had been dismissed from Edinburgh for conducting illegal experiments on asylum patients, methodically damaging specific cranial regions to map brain function. Temperance, the youngest, had been trained in psychological conditioning to augment surgical effects, perfecting techniques that reshaped personality and suppressed memory. Fleeing Europe in 1797, they had reinvented themselves as Anglican nuns, concealing their medical identities to operate without oversight or restraint, perfecting a system of control and cruelty for over 20 years. The manhunt that followed became one of the most extensive criminal investigations of early America. Federal marshals, local sheriffs, and international authorities joined in pursuit, but the sisters had vanished without trace. Investigation revealed multiple escape routes from the convent, a network of safe houses, and vast wealth accumulated from their illicit operations, over $50,000, funneled into accounts across North America and Europe, a fortune in modern terms. Shipping records indicated months of preparation. Equipment and documents had been moved stealthily, anticipating discovery, ensuring their disappearance would be as complete as the secrets they carried. The full scope of their crimes stunned investigators. Over 21 years, more than 600 women had passed through the convent's programs. Approximately 250 were returned to their families, physically intact yet irreversibly altered, personalities reshaped, intellects diminished, emotions recalibrated. 50 women were said to have chosen permanent residence, yet no trace could be found of their whereabouts, raising questions of enforced disappearance. Nearly 200 women were found in hidden chambers, preserved for study, victims of procedures or deliberate execution once they no longer served research objectives. The bodies had been maintained for comparative study, a grisly archive of human manipulation. Even more disturbing was the evidence of a vast network of collaborators. Letters, receipts, and communications demonstrated the sisters had sold research data to medical and academic institutions worldwide, exchanging the results of their human experimentation for wealth and recognition. Universities in Europe, unaware of the full context, had integrated these findings into curricula, unknowingly legitimizing decades of systematic human abuse. Every document, every preserved specimen, every annotation painted the same picture: methodical, deliberate, and unrelenting. The Ashford sisters had catalogued lives, measured thoughts, dissected personalities, and encoded obedience into the human mind. They had transformed women into instruments, vessels stripped of autonomy, and all of it hidden beneath the veneer of sanctity and spiritual devotion. Even now, as the raiding party explored the empty halls, the echoes of the past seemed to linger. The silence was deafening. Shadows stretched along the stone walls, as if the tortured souls catalogued and studied for decades still watched, still waited. It lay not only in the instruments and papers left behind, but in the very architecture of the convent, designed to contain, to break, to transform. The horror of the Ashford sisters was not merely in their cruelty, nor in the screams that had once echoed through these corridors. It was in the meticulous, clinical perfection of their craft, the deliberate reconstruction of minds into compliant, vacant shadows. And those shadows, though hidden from the world, remained, waiting, watching, silent, eternal. Dr. Hartwell was only one of many physicians who had unknowingly contributed to the horrors orchestrated by the Ashford sisters, providing patients medical supplies and tacit approval in exchange for access to their chilling experiments. Postal workers, suppliers, and even some local officials had been paid generously to maintain secrecy, creating a web of complicity that extended through Millbridge and far beyond. Universities across America and Europe had absorbed fragments of the sisters' work into their curricula, teaching surgical techniques and psychological theories rooted in systematic human experimentation carried out deep in the Maine wilderness. The revelation forced society to confront an uncomfortable truth knowledge. Even scientific knowledge can grow from acts of unimaginable cruelty. For the families of the victims, the discovery posed a cruel dilemma. To expose the truth was to risk social ruin, to allow whispers of grotesque experiments to tarnish their names and obliterate their standing in polite society. To remain silent was to live with private agony, knowing their daughters and wives had endured unspeakable suffering. Most chose the latter, the quiet conspiracy of grief and shame ensuring that the full scope of the Ashford sisters' atrocities would remain buried for decades. The official investigation, though thorough, was quietly closed after 6 months, and the remaining evidence sealed in government archives, left untouched for over a century. The final report was chillingly vague, reducing the sisters' 2 decades of terror to a footnote: 3 women operating a fraudulent medical facility had fled, leaving behind irregular treatment records and unanswered questions. The convent itself, long a fortress of horror, was eventually consumed by fire at the hands of local residents who sought to obliterate every trace of what had occurred within its walls. Yet, the sisters' meticulous documentation survived, slipping through the cracks of history to reach medical institutions worldwide. In a bitter irony, research derived from human suffering contributed to legitimate advances in understanding brain function, memory, and psychological disorders. The same knowledge that had been extracted through terror and pain slowly seeped into the framework of modern medicine, a grim reminder that human progress is sometimes built upon the suffering of the innocent. Sarah Whitman, the sole survivor courageous enough to expose the full truth, bore a trauma that never fully healed. For months, she provided testimony to investigators, piecing together the fates of hundreds of women, yet the emotional weight of her experience left her isolated. Society, eager to forget such unsettling truths, offered little comfort. Her family, embarrassed by her revelations, distanced themselves, leaving Sarah to navigate the aftermath alone. She eventually relocated to California under an assumed name, seeking the anonymity that would allow her to survive. There, she worked quietly as a teacher, attempting to rebuild a life shattered by her proximity to unimaginable evil. She never married, maintaining only minimal contact with relatives, a quiet existence haunted by memories that refused to fade. Shortly before her death in 1863, Sarah composed a detailed memoir, the most complete account of life inside the Convent of Eternal Tears. Her writings became invaluable historical evidence, chronicling the Ashford sisters' systematic exploitation and the meticulous methods by which they transformed women into vacant, obedient shadows. The sisters themselves were never apprehended. Over the decades, unconfirmed reports suggested sightings in the Americas and Europe, whispers of them continuing their experiments under assumed identities, preying upon the wealthy and vulnerable alike. A French physician's account placed Dr. Agatha Brennan in Paris in 1856, practicing under a new name, employing methods that bore a disturbing resemblance to those pioneered at the Maine convent. Yet when authorities attempted to verify the claim, she had vanished, leaving behind only tantalizing hints of her true identity. The Convent of Eternal Tears remains one of the most systematic and prolonged examples of human experimentation in American history. The Ashford sisters combined scientific precision with complete moral bankruptcy, constructing an empire of cruelty where lives were measured, dissected, and reshaped. Their meticulous notes, diagrams, and preserved specimens testified to methods that would not be ethically sanctioned or publicly recognized for decades. Yet the human cost was staggering and irreparable. Beyond the horror of their methods lies a deeper, more unsettling truth: the vulnerability of women in early American society. Social pressures, legal constraints, and rigid expectations allowed 3 criminals to operate unchecked for over 20 years. Vulnerable individuals, labeled problematic or defiant, were systematically exploited under the guise of spiritual or medical correction. The Ashford sisters' operations reveal how societal structures can enable, even facilitate, the transformation of scientific ambition into unspeakable atrocity. Perhaps the most chilling element of this story is the silence that followed. Families, officials, and institutions alike chose discretion over accountability. In suppressing the truth, they ensured that these horrors would be forgotten publicly, leaving the door open for similar abuses to reoccur. The case exposes the terrifying potential when knowledge is divorced from compassion, when ambition is unchecked by ethics, and when society permits the vulnerable to be treated as expendable instruments for progress. The legacy of the Ashford sisters forces a haunting question upon us. Could such systematic horrors occur today, hidden behind facades of respectability and scientific advancement? History shows us that without moral oversight, without vigilance, the human desire for control and understanding can become monstrous. The sisters' work, their meticulous, clinical transformation of human beings, serves as a reminder that cruelty is not always loud. It can be precise, patient, and devastatingly effective. The shadows of the past linger, waiting in the corners of memory, whispering lessons society would prefer to ignore. Sarah Whitman's courage, the only beacon of truth to illuminate the full horror, reminds us that vigilance, testimony, and moral courage are the only antidotes to such calculated evil. What do you make of this story? Can we truly comprehend how these atrocities remained hidden for so long, cloaked in piety, knowledge, and social obedience. The evidence suggests that knowledge pursued without human compassion, without ethical responsibility, can create horrors that defy understanding, that challenge our conception of civilized society. The Ashford sisters, the Convent of Eternal Tears, and the silent victims who never found a voice remain a chilling testament to the dangers of ambition untethered from morality. Their legacy is a shadow over history, a whisper of what occurs when brilliance is corrupted and humanity is stripped away. The echoes of their deeds are not entirely gone. They linger in every shadow, every whispered secret, every unspoken fear, reminding us that vigilance, empathy, and truth are the only barriers against repeating the horrors of the past. For those who seek the truth, who peer into the shadows of history, the story of the Ashford sisters endures, and as gospel of the haunted will reveal time and again, some darkness refuses to remain buried forever, waiting, watching, silent, eternal.